Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Historia Politica Publica. In the episode of today, I will talk about an essay written by Mark Massauer, which is called The Strange Triumph of Human Rights from 1933-1950, and I will talk about how the idea of the human rights permeate into the societies during and after the Second World War. There was the creation of the United Nations in 1945 after the war, and this idea to protect the rights of every person will serve in theory to save the life of millions of people. However, as we can see nowadays, there are different kind of people who are more protected than others. So paraphrasing George Orwell in his book Animal Farm, everybody is equal, but there are some that are more equal than others. And even during that time, 1945, with the idea of the human right, there were massacres being committed. For example, the massacre in Sétif in the 8th of May in Algeria. After the defeat of Hitler, the Algerians took advantage of the situation to proclaim the independence. They did demonstration across the country, demanding for self-determination, because Churchill and Roosevelt had signed the UN Charter some years before, in which they proclaimed the right to every people to decide their own future. But the French army crossed by only this demonstration, and the statistics are quite different. There are some who point that only 1,000 people were killed, if only can be applied to this context. The Algerian sources mention between 15,000 and 45,000. Anywho, the thing is, like, even though the idea of human rights was being expanded across the world, it did not apply to every situation. So, for Massauer, the importance of the language of human rights since 1948 in international democracy had appealed within the global community. That was a triumph of human rights, the triumph of civilization over realpolitik and barbarism, and of the state interest. After the defeat of fascism, it was a common consensus, with only last a couple of years until the start of the Cold War, in which the democratic currents, being liberal democracy or communism, had joined together to defeat the main threat. Precisely the Constitution of Italy, it had a kind of point which rejects any kind of fascist organization to reach again the power, although this constitution was changed years later. And also it proclaims the anti-fascist front, which it was created after 1935, in which I think it was the 7th Congress of the Comintern, the kind of chairs of that conference appeal for the creation of popular fronts in the whole world. That happened in Chile, in France, in Spain. The thing, it was like to ally themselves with the bourgeois parties like Liberal Democrats, Social Democrats, and so on, with the communists in order to defeat fascism. So, as I talked in previous episode, this kind of experiment was creating a common organization in order to protect the right of minorities was also created some years before. In 1918, after the First World War, there was a kind of similar charter, but there was it did not succeed and failed to protect the minorities. Basically, there was a dismissal of the idea of making the minority rights regime universal. For example, the United States, the European states reject the League of Nations interference in this matter. The ethnic minorities were ignored, excluded, and displaced. And considering that in those years after the collapse of empires, there were millions of people wandering across Europe looking for shelter, and they were mostly dismissed by any country. And as they did not have legal rights to go around, they were dismissed. It will not have mattered, I think, if they had legal rights anyway, because nowadays we see the situation with the migrants dying in the Mediterranean. They had the right to to be sheltered by the other countries. They are asylum seekers, refugees, and they have the legal, not just the moral right, but also the legal right to be sheltered. And what happened that Europe are not letting these people enter, and recently over 60 people died at the shores of Italy. They were failed to be rescued before orders of the Italian neo-fascist regime. So, going back to the legislation that was implemented in the 1940s, in 1942 there was the Declaration of the United Nations that had the next slogan, quote, "To preserve human rights and justice in their own lands as well as in other lands." H.G. Wells, the famous writer of The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, When the Sleeper Awakes, The Invisible Man, or The World of Worlds, he coined this idea and he defined it as the right of man. And his kind of statement was used later on for the creation of the United Nations and the idea of human rights. The political theorist Queen's Wright mentioned how, quote, "effective international organization of peace is not possible unless it protects basic human rights against encroachment by national states," end quote. Again, that was a beautiful idea that unfortunately it is not being fulfilled nowadays. We see that with the migrants from Yemen, from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from any kind of country apart from Ukraine, in which they are being welcomed by the Western countries, which I obviously celebrate. I think it's a great effort of solidarity by the Western countries, and it's something that is well to be praised. But the thing is that should be applied to every refugee across the world. But why at that particular moment, as Tony Judt mentioned in other essay that I analyzed, that the situation after the Second World War was unique and never to be repeated? There were many different factors going there, a global juncture after the war that created the perfect conditions in order for establish this kind of organization. Well, so the reason for human rights emergence was a kind of bulwark against Nazi and fascism, the combination of figures from different spectrums, again, communists, liberal democrats, social democrats, or whatever. And as Eric Hobsbawm, the historian, there was a strange alliance of liberal democracy and communism. Roosevelt, in 1941, the president of the United States, had mentioned that, quote, "the supremacy of human rights everywhere must be applied." United States felt a necessity to create a universal normative to be protected. In that sense, UK was reluctant to include the colonies in this paradigm, and this was something interesting because the people in the colonies fought for their emancipation, but Churchill or the French government believed that this kind of UN charter in which it was created to stop fascism and Nazism should not be applied for the people in India, in Ghana, in Algeria, or any kind of colony led by either France or the United Kingdom. Human rights seem a better alternative than the minority rights which was tried to be implemented during the interwar years. For example, many Jews remarked the importance to protect their rights as individuals than as a group, according to Mark Massauer. There was President Edward Benz in Czechoslovakia who said the next statement, quote, "The protection of minorities in the future should consist in the defense of human democratic rights and not of national rights," end quote. In other words, that everybody in the world should have the same rights to be protected. If these persons are fleeing from their country, they will need to be protected by other people in any kind of region all over the world. Minority rights, although this is important to say that even President Benz had this kind of nice statement, at the same time he was expulsing the Germans from his country after the Second World War. So again, this was a perfect metaphor of a good idea who the person who is voicing it is at the same time corrupting his own approach. Minority rights would have meant to free colonize, give right to black in the USA, according to Massauer, hence the power reject this approach. So, how paradoxical is it that even though they allied themselves against Nazism, fascism, because they were considered the most evils over the world, they still perpetuate a system of oppression against the black in the United States, the Algerians in the colony, the people in Africa, in India, in Asia, and every kind of countries. So you have here how the liberal democracies, France, United Kingdom, or the United States raised the banner of equality, of freedom, of fraternity, and at the same time they were still crushing their own people or people in the colonies. I call this hypocrisy. 1946, you had Hungary that advocated for a similar system of the League of Nations to protect Hungarian minorities, but again, it was rejected by the British, the Americans, and again, another kind of ally, which was the Soviets. The British, the Soviets, the Americans, the French, the four alliances who had defeated the Nazis and the fascists were against protecting the minorities. This is interesting for studying history because we have always been told that the Allies were the good guys in the Second World War. These four people, the Soviet Union, the United States, France, and the United Kingdom, they allied themselves to defeat the evil, but at the same time they were committing crimes in their own soil or beyond their borders. The Chinese, at the same time that they were in their own revolution, wanted to include racial equality, and while Roosevelt proposed this kind of solution, the Russian and the British reject this approach, so they have a lot of kind of fights within themselves. There was a criticism to the governments from the whole world about this kind of new implementation. The people in the United States, New Zealand, South American countries, the India, etc. For example, in the United States, the polls showed how the people wanted that US should lead the new world. It was an idea to create an international community rather than stay isolated as they have done after the First World War. In that sense, the countries reject the idea of an international body with the capacity to impose rules in their respective territories. It's in previous episode I spoke how in the European Union or the European Community as was called before, the nations reject this idea that a supranational body could interfere within their national affairs. That similar thing happened with the international community. And Mark Massauer mentioned how all the countries all reject this idea of creating something which could have more power than their own nation. In that sense, the UN Charter, which had some ideas of human rights, freedoms, and so on. It was basically, according to Hans Kelsen, quote, empty phrases, because it was just a rhetoric, but it did not want to implement different kind of measures to apply these ideas of human rights, freedom, and so on. In that sense, for Massauer, the document, the UN Charter, reflects the great powers' keenest interest in preserving their sovereignty intact. In that sense, the human rights rhetoric was deliberately bereft of mechanisms that might have had it enforceable. It was for them appropriate to explain in nice words how people should be protected, but at the same time, they did not implement a legal mechanism to make sure that those ideas were to be implemented. In that sense, the United Nations recently created had no right to intervention. That was supported by Britain, Canada, the United States, and Australia. What a surprise, considering that the British Empire had many colonies all over the world and did not want, obviously, that the United Nations went there and say, okay, if you have signed this charter in which you proclaim the right of self-emancipation of the different people of the world, now let people in Kenya, in Ghana, in India, and in other colonies in the Caribbean to be free from your oppression yoke. In 1947, there was a long petition on behalf of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, written by Du Bois, about the discrimination in the United States, but it was dismissed as the other kind of ideas who wanted to be implemented. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights appeared in 1948. It was, according to Frank Holman, the president of the American Bar Association, a revolutionary in character and an attempt to promote state socialism, if not communism, through the world. So, this idea was interesting because protecting the rights of everybody, creating an equalitarian system, it was considered by an important member of the United States as a kind of threat to the ideas of liberalism in the Western world. It could fail easily into communism, because communism at the end is this kind of society without a state, in which you had people were equal, they have the same opportunities, and everybody will have right to do everything. So obviously the rhetoric of the human rights, it aligned perfectly with these leftist ideas, being anarchism, communism, or socialism. And henceforth, even though human rights was a great idea, it stayed in the imaginary of many people, as happened today, the mechanism to be implemented were failing. And nowadays, in 2023, we see how people dying in the shores of the Mediterranean, people being killed in different countries, in Ukraine, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Syria, all of them through external intervention, being by Russia, by the United Kingdom, by Saudi Arabia, by the United States, and other areas of the world, have demonstrated how the concept of the human rights, even though can have a great appeal among the common people, it had failed to permeate within the elites, because it was precisely them that did not want to expand those ideas beyond mere rhetoric and to create legal mechanism to be sure that all the minorities, all the people in the world will be protected.